Hello, welcome to another episode of Live Saturdays with Kwadwo and Kwesi, and I'm happy to welcome you to our series Enabling Learning. In the last episode, we looked at the things that affect our students' ability to learn. That is why so many of our learners make slow progress. In this very episode, we want to look at effective techniques to aid students' recall. In episode 1, we came to the conclusion that literacy and numeracy gaps are one of the fundamental reasons why our students make slow progress across a lot of studies that we have to look into. And even in Ghana, we realize that most of our learners are not able to make the progress that they need to make because they have literacy and numeracy gaps. We also realize that continual underachievement has a huge impact on the self-esteem of our learners. And so students that are consistently failing are not so confident of themselves, and they don't even believe they can even do what they are required to do to make the progress that we expect of them. We enumerated a lot of things that you could do, among others, building numeracy skills, spacing, guided practice, and others. We want to encourage you to look out for our first episode on enabling learning on edutransform.gh on all social media platforms, and follow and then us, and also watch the various series that we did. But most importantly, watch episode 1 of this particular series on enabling learning, so that we can together continue to make a discussion on what it is that our learners need so that they can also learn as much as we want them to do. As usual, I have with me my colleague on the other side, Kwesi. Kwesi, how are you?
I'm well, for you.
It's very wonderful to have you on the other side for us to continue our discussion on learning. It is one of the paramount things that educators need to be passionate about, and we can never cease to be excited when we have the opportunity to talk about learning. In this very episode, we will be looking at some 4 key objectives on this under effective techniques to aid students' recall. We want to cover encoding, the skill set of encoding, forgetting, retrieval, and the techniques that we need to get all these skills well cemented in us. And so we will be spending time in the next few minutes to look at encoding, retrieval. And so, Kwesi, how does learning happen?
Thank you very much. I think that the whole idea of learning is somehow misunderstood. And it has to do with our appreciation of the memory processes, the processes that are associated with how we are able to keep information in, store them, and also how we bring out information or give out information. And there are these 3 important processes. The encoding process is the part where we get the information in, either a teacher explaining concepts or giving a lecture, or you reading a book or watching a movie, any processes that we use to get information in, either getting information from a text, a table, a diagram, and all of those processes. That is one important memory process, which has to do with learning. But unfortunately, many of us think that learning is all about encoding information, right?
Okay.
And if you look at the whole process of teaching and learning, it focuses more on the encoding process of getting information in, right? Of making sure that we have enough knowledge. And I will agree that even with the Bloom's taxonomy that shows the levels of thinking, knowledge is the foundational aspect of it. So it's not surprising that the whole education system seems to focus on strategies or learning tools that focus on getting information in. So more traditional ways of teaching focus on that, getting information in, not retrieval, getting information out. The only part that we focus on retrieval is where we are examining students or testing students, where we expect them to be able to get information out of their memory, right? But we have to understand the 3 important processes of memory that is important for learning. Other than that, we'll miss out on what our understanding of learning really is. And that is a misconception, really, that informs a lot of instructional practices, that learning has to do with getting information in. Even if a students have to learn, they think that rereading the text rather helps them to learn, right? Our own definition of learning, which actually influences most of the traditional practices of teaching and learning, which supports the encoding process. And that is defining learning as being taught, getting information into your head, right? And keeping it so that one day, nobody knows one day, the teachers will like to surprise you with a test so that
Yeah, yeah.
to see whether you have the information, right? Because
Learning.
yeah, so they think that learning is all about getting information, and if you are not able to bring it out on that day where they chooses to be the exams or the test, then you are deemed not to be performing. So even though surprisingly we do all things in relation to encoding knowledge, but in assessment, we focus on retrieving. But the whole learning process does not focus on retrieving information or knowledge, but more on the encoding aspect of learning. And there are certain research that has been done that points to the fact that this process does not really help with learning. It is not the best way to learn, and it does not enable students to even recall when they are asked to do so, especially during an assessment process. Right? That this particular research that is cited here clearly indicates that repeated testing rather enhances learning than repeated reading of a text, right? And which often confers limited benefit beyond the gains from the initial rereading of a material. So just rereading a material which we think is studying or learning does not really lead to meaningful learning. And it does not even enable the student to develop the skill set that will enable that child to recall the information that they are learning. So, like I said, our teaching and learning process methodologies and approaches has focused on just an aspect of the memory process, which is encoding. And the research clearly points to the fact that these traditional beliefs of reteaching, if teachers have to revise the students, they think they have to go over everything they've taught them so that they can remember or review everything or reread everything. It does not enhance learning or students' achievement overall. And I think in Ghana, the statistics is clear in terms of the slow progress that students make. If rereading and reteaching and reviewing the material does enhances learning as the traditional teaching and learning processes believe, then we should have a lot of more students actually doing extremely well on our standard-based assessments or testing that we give students. But the opposite is the case. So that tells you that we need to actually give some thoughts and thinking to these research that challenges the traditional beliefs about what really enables learning or what enhances students' learning and achievement.
It's so shocking for me looking at the fact that we've always assumed that once the teacher stands in and then delivers instruction, then learning is happening. And so it's about me giving out to the student. And once that is happening, once I see a student opening the book and reading, he's learning. But to contrast it, it's not about just reading or rereading it, but it goes more beyond. But then I think touch with this is the fact that students also care. They will tend to do a lot of teaching, a lot of instructional delivery. They probably will reread and all that, but they tend to forget. What leads to forgetting?
If you look at the memory processes, there are three main, as I indicated. There is not only encoding, but there's also storage. So even if you are teaching and learning processes, is skewed towards encouraging students to get information in without thinking about storing the information, then you'll be faced with a nightmare of the forgetting curve. That the rate at which you forget, the brain forget things, is really high.
We are wired to forget. We are not wired to remember.
Exactly. So the rate at which we forget is really high. And from his research, he realized that learning a new information like we are just doing right now, if you're just using encoding processes to construct understanding of what we are sharing, even in this conversation, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, you'll forget everything that we have said in this particular talk or conversation that we're having about teaching and learning and what enables learning, right? So he used a more mathematical approach in terms of how much information does it take in and how much of it does he retain over a period. And that is how the curve look like. That with time, we all humans forget greatly a lot of the things that we have been taught, right? And that is what you see. If whatever you learn after 31 days, you'll remember only 21% of that.
Even if you learned it very well, you stored it very well.
Reviewing, rereading it, reteaching it, you are most likely
your best chances are only 21% will stay.
Exactly. So over time, you lose a lot of the things that what you call it that you've learned, and it's not surprising that a number of our students actually forget, and teachers keep saying that they ask questions and nobody seems to have a clue as to what the teacher is actually referring to, and they get surprised that the students forget that they are not learning. They are not putting the effort. And when they say they are not learning, it still boils to the traditional understanding of encoding. That is, they are not getting the information in. And that accounts for why they are forgetting. But I think this particular study should tell us as educators that anything that you teach in the first 15 minutes, students are going to lose all of it, a greater percentage of that, right? And over time, they are going to lose almost all of it over time. So it's very steep. It drops steeply after you've completed a learning experience. So teachers need to have this understanding so that they can use a more appropriate tools or techniques in ensuring that a lot of the information that students are encoding is actually stored for retrieval when they need it through assessment. And that is a key aspect that I think is the biggest nightmare as far as traditional teaching is concerned, because it's more skewed toward encoding knowledge or the encoding.
So you will say that for us to not forget, then there is a need for us to be able to store it in a more secure way, right? Yes. And so storage is one of the key things we also need to look at. How does that one also occur?
Right. So the point here is that over time, you'll forget most of the information, right? So we need to understand the second process as far as memory processes are concerned, and that is storage. So when you are taking information, like you are taking this information about the conversation we are having, how is the information stored in your memory, right? So the first place where information is stored is your working memory. This is our working memory. Are you listening to us? That is your working memory. That's your short-term memory. And if necessary, then that information may move. It's not automatic, so that's why I'm using the word. It may move into your long-term memory. So when a child sits in a class and is listening to a teacher explaining things and keep talking and talking for a long time, that information is in the short-term memory. That is a working memory while the child was in that side. Remember, over time, just time, not anything, not the person's ability or his intellect, but time. Over time, he will actually forget a greater part of that. Right? So it has nothing to do with the student's ability. It's just time will take away the information. And forgetting is very important, just as remembering is important, as far as our brain health is concerned. So that is the first place of information that we receive is stored in the short-term memory. But you have to be mindful of how long does it last there, okay? So the first place the information is stored is in your short-term memory. And it only stays there, a piece of information stays there for between 15 to 30 seconds, right? So you remember the forgetting curve, so it tells you that if it is just 15 to 30 seconds, then it's likely that within an hour lesson, students might have forgotten a greater part of the things that the teacher have said at the beginning, all right? So if we really have to help students learn and remember things so that they can use the information to solve problems, to evaluate things, to synthesize, to analyze, to do the higher levels of thinking, then I tell you that a teacher needs to do a lot more work, right, as far as teaching and learning is concerned. And I think that is the content of this conversation, to make sure the information actually lasts, right, and students can actually recall the information easily, right? So just teaching by talking, that is something that we've been speaking and hammering over, that it does not enable learning. Just getting information in and coding. Within 15 to 30 seconds, that information is completely lost. And this has nothing to do with a student's ability or his talent or giftings or his IQ. It's just time. Over time, that information, the brain loses it, okay, in the short-term memory. And what is even more interesting is that within the short memory, you can only store about between 5 to 8 pieces of information. Okay, so maybe
More scary.
so on average, you can actually keep about 7 pieces of information within the which is going to last you within 15 to 30 seconds, and that information is lost. And it has nothing to do with ability, it just has to do with time. Tells you that for you to move that information into the permanent storage, which is your long-term memory, it is not something that just comes easily or just that happened because you were taught the whole curriculum. You know, a lot of especially secondary teachers are more concerned about completing the syllabus and thinking that students will be better off, but they will forget uh, that syllabus. If it is a 2-year program, it's a 3-year program, a greater percentage of that when they are about writing their final exam, right? Because even in one lesson, they are losing
A
a
lot of
greater chunk of what you are teaching them within 15 to 30 seconds. And they can only keep an average of 7 pieces of those set of information in the short-term memory. But there are ways which I think we will touch on as far as this is concerned. So it means that whatever you are able to store in the short-term memory or you're able to move in the long-term memory is only relevant if you can record them or retrieve it. Because at the end of the day, your success as a student is determined on your retrieval process. Okay, how you do or how you perform on the test, your ability to recall, to give out information, right, to bring out information out of your memory. That is what determines student success. But the unfortunate thing is that traditional approaches of learning is actually confused that learning happens with encoding, right? Meanwhile, the assessment in those classrooms is focusing on the retrieval process of memory process, which many students have not been equipped to actually to develop a strong retrieval process in getting those information that they need in order even to do well in an assessment, in a class test, or even to use that information to solve uh, authentic real life problems as they encounter it.
what you just said even strikes me the more when I think of the fact that as we try to even store information,
Mm.
interferences can even come in.
Yeah.
And we're talking about just between 15 to 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there are times that even my thought, recollecting what I want to say,
Yeah.
somebody says something, something just flashes by my eyes, and then I get distracted, and I don't even remember what I want to say. And all these hindrances are there for our learners. And so,
Yeah.
like you said, if it's about just passing the information as if it is something where they just have to encode it, then definitely we're going to have a problem with the ability to recall in terms of not forgetting it, storage, and all that. But then, how do we know learning is taking place in all this?
So the first aspect of it is that we have misconstrued learning.
Yeah,
We think that learning happens through encoding,
yeah.
but it actually happens through retrieval, right? Because I mean, what
Wait,
I think
it's a very important statement.
we think
Learning does not
actually
occur through encoding, but rather
encoding,
occurs through retrieval.
yes, meaningful learning comes through retrieval because that is what we actually use to test whether students have learned at the end of the day. Even
Yeah,
though we focus on encoding through the teaching and learning process, but when it wants to determine that the students have been successful, we rather want them to sit in an exam without looking at any book. We want
yes,
them to be able to bring out information out of their memory, which is
yeah,
retrieval, as an evidence that they have learned.
yeah.
So why not use the retrieval process, right? If that is a good indicator of learning, then why not focus on the retrieval process as a key part of enabling learning within your classroom when you are teaching. Like the point that you gave earlier on, I think that this whole story thing, it happens to all of us even as adults. You know,
Yeah.
at times even in your own home, you said you are going to pick something, you will walk to that place and you have
Somebody
forgotten
said fake. Yeah.
within a few seconds, you don't even remember that you said you are going to this place to pick this, right? You have to stay there for a long time to retrieve the information from your memory, then you can say that, oh, this is what I was actually going to, before you can move on to text. So you see that learning actually happens through retrieval, but not through encoding. And that is a nightmare of the African classroom, right? In terms of the teaching and learning practices, right? That is so skill and encoding based instruction and learning strategies instead of retrieval processes. So it's retrieval that actually uh, enables learning. And again, we can look at some few research on this. Students, college students were actually assessed in terms of their learning practices, right? What they do. And it came up that a lot of them actually use encoding-based strategies. An example could be is a concept map, right? So the students, they were supposed to learn some words from this research, but they realized that those who were calling out the information out of memory instead of reviewing and rereading it, right, demonstrated a good score in terms of getting a greater percentage of the tasks correct, as you can see in the chart. So the chart clearly tells you that retrieval practices, right, enhances a student or anybody's long-term meaningful learning than even effective encoding knowledge strategies like a concept map. And I guess you agree that concept maps are very useful tools for learning. But retrieval practices builds even critical thinking skills. It helps the students to remember more. It aids learning more than encoding practices. And that is what this research actually points out. So just getting knowledge in through encoding memory techniques, unfortunately, is the number one, as we've kept saying, learning strategy, and it's the one teaching strategy among educators. But it does not, from these research, as you can see, really points to a better outcome for learning for students. So learning actually happens through retrieval. Retrieval is what creates learning. Learning happens when we focus on enabling students to get information out instead of getting information in. That is very simplistic, but it is something that is empirically verified from research that learning is enabled, achievements and performances are enhanced when you focus your instructional practices and learning practices on getting information or knowledge out than just encoding information or getting information in.
All right. It's very shocking for me that it is rather the retrieval we need to be focusing on, yeah. Except looking at the encoding aspect of it. I know we'll have to spend some time in looking at some instructional practices that will aid us to retrieve. Are there some practical things we can do that helps us to retrieve information?
Right. There's a lot teachers can do if to get students to get information or the knowledge that they are acquiring in the classroom out of their memory. And there's also a lot that students can do as well. So like we said, retrieval creates learning. So when we focus on getting the information out of the student's head, instead of getting information into the student's head, which is the encoding-based processes, we don't only enhances learning, but we also, as I said, enhances students' performance. And this can be done with no extra money, with no extra classes, and with no additional technology, no increase in resources, right? So there are specific things that teachers actually can do to help bring out information out of students' head, help them to retrieve information than just encode it. One simple thing that every teacher can do is this thing: frequent small testing. Don't teach a whole unit and test students. The cognitive psychologists call this the testing effect. actively and frequently testing students' memory retention when students are learning new knowledge. Frequent small testing. In fact, if those that have followed our discussion, when we talked about the principles of effective teaching using Barack Rosenshine's research, he clearly outlined that teachers have to do in effective classrooms. Teachers were doing weekly testing and monthly tests. So at the end of every week, whatever you have learned, you are tested. And then you'll be tested throughout the week. And at the end of the month, you'll be tested on whatever you've learned. So in this class, students, the emphasis is on getting information out of your head than just getting information in. So this is a simple thing that every educator can actually do this, right? Just testing your students, no big tests, but frequent small tests. And teaching till the end to test students is a poor way of aiding recall or enable students to actually learn and enhance their learning, because you are focusing on encoding and you're encouraging your students to focus on encoding by having a chunk of information to review, which they have forgotten a greater percentage of it over time, because that information, they have never been challenged to use it in any way, right? So if you are just testing them at the end of the term, then if you know you test them at the end of the term, that is important that you do weekly testing throughout the term, and you will see an appreciable increase in students' performance in your end of term assessment. Right, and that is it's just a very simple idea, but it's proven by research through cognitive psychologists, proving that this thing really works, and it does enable
Very
learning.
true what you say, because I've already seen students when they know they have, that's what this teacher, when I go to their class, I will be tested. They prepare because they know that they are not just going to go and sit down and be given new information, but they will need to give account of information that has already been given to them. And so they prepare towards it. And I think, like we're saying, testing and then making sure that it's frequent, small tests is really crucial for this. Are there any other strategies that we should be looking at?
There are several of them. We've talked about most of them, but I just want to emphasize these ones: interleaving effect and then the spacing effect. You see, when students, so the idea is that text them frequently in small text, right? But also make sure that whatever they are learning never leaves the text is part of the assessment. So if students in the math lesson are dealing with adding and subtracting numbers, they've done that in a period, they are now moving to multiplication. If you are testing them, don't leave the addition and the subtraction out of it. Don't just block. You know, that's one thing that we do. We block the assessment and we mask it. And that thing has proven from research doesn't work.
You
It
do
doesn't
choose to forget because you only focus on the ones that is current.
exactly, exactly. So if students are challenged in the at exams where they are supposed to use multiple skills or knowledge in solving a particular problem, then they find it difficult remembering all the components of it, right? So what teachers can do is to help students practice multiple skills in the same learning session. So if you are taught additions, don't leave additions off the test. There should always be additions. If you are moving into subtraction, there should be addition questions and subtraction questions. And if you are moving into multiplication, you should have addition, subtraction, and multiplication always on the text that is being assessed. So it means that you give the students that information that in this class, right, you don't just learn something and shelve it. You are supposed to remember all the skill set and all the knowledge that we are studying in this test because they are very important even as we move forward, right? So we need to encourage teachers, and that's something that we, through our discussion, that blocking assessment and massing it. Blocking is you do addition and you test students on addition and you shelve it. And then you go into subtraction and then you deal with subtraction and you shelve it. I mean, the same with a language teacher might be dealing with nouns today. They finish with nouns and they shelve it. They go to adjectives and they shelve it. They go to adverbs, they shelve it. The same with a computing teacher or the art teacher or the music teacher. We kind of block assessment. And then at the end of the term, then we want to do interleaving effects. We want the students to write a text that is testing all the multiple knowledge or skills or understanding at the same time. How are they going to remember?
It definitely will not.
Exactly. So because you have not really practiced interleaving effects over a period of time, through a weekly or a month and plus the monthly testing or frequent testing process. So when you do that, what you're doing is that you actually space the assessment instead of massing it. Okay, so when it's the end of the term and the student is writing a test in maths and it includes addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, the child is ready to go because throughout the term, on the weekly or the monthly assessment, these skills are being tested, and that the child is being forced throughout the learning process to really retrieve information as it relates to these four skill sets of adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So the end of term exams will not be a shocker to them, right? They will be able to easily retrieve the information and they will be able to do well. Even the so-called weak or struggling students will make a lot of progress if we think about the interleaving and the spacing effects, where we give students opportunity to practice multiple skills in the same learning session over an appropriate expressed time span. That is one thing that every educator can do to really in their classroom to aid recall, right? Another thing that we can also look at in terms of is that when we are teaching, it is important that we don't make the instruction and the learning process boring. Make it different, okay? Be creative, right? You have to have a deep understanding of what exactly you want the students to learn, right? And then think about what exactly you want them to do so that they can learn that, okay? Being dramatic and unusual helps students to remember than just a boring lecture or a boring talking by the teacher, long explanations on ending without anything memorable, right? Within the learning space that the students can associate their learning with, right? So you need to get your students leave your class saying that, oh, today we did this, then this and that to learn this, right? That is very important.
I share this particular experience where I remember using this, I think garden eggs or yasantra, how they call it,
Yeah.
and with broomsticks entered my class, and then I just started joining the knots and creating triangles and other shapes. And that alone, the students started asking, what are we going to learn? Why do you have this there? And they really wanted to continue the lesson, even when I had ended.
Yeah.
And I remember when I gave them the project of making their own 2D shapes, I didn't have to chase them.
Yeah.
I didn't have to chase them at all because it was something unusual for them. They would probably have had a situation whereby they have drawn on papers and all that. And I just felt, let me do something different. So I really can identify with what you're talking about, that when they have something memorable about the lesson, they will remember it.
Right. So I mean, that's one thing that teachers can do. I mean, when you think about whatever you are planning to teach, the question that before you teach that lesson, think about how can we do this differently? What else can we do to make
Yeah.
this different? Not so usual, not so
Other
mundane.
creative ways of doing this.
Exactly. So, for example, one thing that we do, for example, when you're teaching economics, the concept of demand. I always use that example because I think a lot of people can relate to that. We can easily tell the students through a lecture that when the price falls, more is demanded. But can you think about actually creating a scenario in the classroom for students to look for prices and quantities, right? And actually using the mass concept of line graph to plot the demand curve and making their own inference.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
That is an experience. You
Yeah,
understand?
that's so wonderful for them to see this concept of demand and supply. Yeah.
Exactly. So these are things that teachers can do in their class. If you're teaching economics and you're dealing with macroeconomics, you should put the students in the context of taking roles. Like if you are the finance minister and you're about reading the budget, looking at the economic indicators, what would be some of your policy if you are teaching about policy? Uh,
Right.
yeah, so teachers can think about something different and make it different. And when you make the learning different and unusual for students, it also aids learning, remembering, and learning. Meaningful learning happens through that process, right? We've talked about this over and over again, starters and plenaries. They are also one very important tool that teachers can incorporate in their instruction to help students remember a lot of the things that they are taught. And it is clear from research that students remember or learn more at the beginning and at the end of the lesson, not from the middle. They learn more at the beginning and at the end than they do at the middle of than they do from the middle of the lesson. So it's important that we're mindful of this, that after every learning objective, you should have a starter and a plenary. These things should not happen just at the beginning and at the end of the lesson. But in accomplishing a learning goal, the learning activities that you use, you can have a mini starter and a plenary to review for students to check whether they have been able to achieve the learning intention before you move on to the next learning objective. That is, if you have more than one learning objective within the lesson. So if you structure a lesson in episodes like that, with clear starters and beginning and closing activities for students to review their learning, a lot of the learning is remembered and it really sticks in students' mind. And that retrieval is easy because this process of starters and plenaries are actually a retrieval practice because
Yes.
the students are going to call out information out of their memory. They are not going to take information in. And that process is very key in enabling them to learn. One other important strategy also is making time for thinking. That I know recently I just have a conversation with students about what really makes them learn. And they all said this, that the teachers should teach so that they understand, right? And so if they can recall information, then they have to understand it first properly, right? And to understand something properly, you should give the students opportunity to raise the questions, like you said, an example you gave about shapes. Once they are asking the questions, right, and they are getting answers to the questions, and they are thinking about what they are about learning and what they are going to be engaged with, it helps them to really process the information well, and it helps them to really understand it well. So we need to remember that students remember what we teach them if they understand it first, if they're able to understand it properly first. And that can happen if you really create space in developing students' thinking skills and curiosity as far as the learning process is concerned. I mean, the last thing that I want to talk about is context. We need to know that people remember context much more than content.
Break it down, please.
The context of learning is so key. And unfortunately, in most classes where it's teacher talking, and there is not activities that students are engaging in order to learn, which is the context of learning, a lot of the knowledge or the content that we want them to encode is actually not uh, taken in and is not properly stored, and they are most likely not going to be remembered, right? So if teachers are going to teach any concept, I think the first question that every instructor needs to ask themselves is, what are the students going to do, okay, in order to learn, right? So you are teaching students about weight differentials, right? You're teaching them about weight differentials. Why not create a labor market in your classroom and have businesses in the classroom where they're employing accountants, teachers, or business executive business development officers, leaders of the enterprise, managers, and then the students go through the process of negotiating their salaries uh, with in mind a certain skill set that they are supposed to have per the job description. If you create that context through that process, they will begin to realize that there is something called transfer earnings and there are something called economic rent that actually distinguish between why, even though Messi is in Barcelona, he earns economic rent, not just transfer earnings. Transfer earnings, for example, are the minimal amounts that somebody would like to receive to stay in a particular job, right? But some people have exceptional abilities, and for that matter, they earn beyond the transfer earning, which is the economic rent. In fact, some people earn economic rent because their skill set is what the organization needs. And they cannot find it. There are no substitute to it, right? And for that matter, they are boxing, paying them a huge amount of salaries. As you can see, the more gifted soccer players, how much they receive and how much the others in the same team also receive. You see the contract. But if you create a labor market atmosphere in the class where students are actually looking for jobs and salaries are being negotiated, uh, with the context of their skill sets and what the job demands requirements are. How are the students going to forget that content? They are not going to forget that content because the content has been put in context, right, for them. And that is how teachers have to be very creative in terms of what they teach. That whatever they teach, they should think about the context of learning more than the content of learning. Because if the content can only be remembered when there's a more meaningful context for students to engage in a meaningful activity, that really enables them to do learn the context of the content of the lesson. So without context, content
All
alone,
right. So if
which,
I get that, the context could also be if I do a role play
yeah,
so that the students can easily remember what we did. It should be the medium within which we learn that context, that content. That is
yeah,
what is really essential for them so that anytime I need to recall, then I can have that medium will come. Or I remember it was in this lesson that we were doing this so
mhm,
that I can easily remember that. And if that context is missing, it's quite dry for the students to follow whatever you were that they were being taught. Is that the
yeah.
case?
Yes. For example, if you have a literature class, you check into a literature class,
Yeah.
and all you do is reading and
It is
discussing.
very
Uh,
boring. The context,
while while
the,
the students can actually dramatize what they are reading,
yeah.
right, and pick up roles and acts like that
And they will
throughout the
put
reading.
in much more effort if they know they are going to dramatize this particular difficult Shakespeare's play or
Yes,
something,
yes,
because they need to understand the context, the history, the time span they were in, and then before they can actually put a role play to this. And
yes,
teachers sometimes will think, oh, it is time consuming. When are we going to finish this? But you finish fast, but they can't remember anything. And
exactly.
that becomes a problem for your learners. Yeah. For me, I think one thing that really strikes me with the examples of instructional practices that aid sound recall is make the learning different and unusual.
Yeah,
It really strikes me as something that if I ever go into a lesson and I have this mindset that I'm going to make it different and unusual, my creativity will be sparked on all the time. If I don't go with that mindset, I will always do that boring, dragging lessons and will turn back and blame the students that they are not serious, they are not ready to give in their best. But even in church, we suffer when the sermon is not exciting. So about more about a school where most of the students are not there because they want to be there anyway. they are compelled to be there, and all that. We've majored so much on the teachers and what they can do. How about the learners? Are there specific things, specific study skills or something they also need to help them be able to make things for themselves?
Yeah, there's a lot students can do as well to help them remember the things, the information or the knowledge that they have encoded. The first thing here is that being in the same state, and the word state is very important, in which the information was first learned, when we first encode the information, enables you to better remember that encoded information, right? So I had a conversation with a student who said that whenever she sits in the classroom, she's able to remember if she learns on her own and take maybe past questions and solve them. She's able to do all of that. But immediately she gets into the exams room, right? I think she freezes, she gets anxious, and she seems to forget almost everything. So I was having a conversation with her, and I dived deep into how she learned before the exams. I mean, her learning before the preparation before the exam. And I realized that even though she's solving past questions, she doesn't take she's not mindful that every paper has a time duration. And that means that each question has a specific amount of minutes that you expected from to spend on that. So if you are practicing on your own without creating the same conditions, you are going to have a problem, because when you get into the exams room, you're not going to realize that you don't have enough time to complete a task. And that is where the anxiety was coming from. And that is one thing that I think a lot of students forget, that the state you were in when you were picking and coding the information is equally important for the retriever, okay? Is equally important for getting the information out. And that is why we're saying that if teachers can make sure that the instruction, they create context, they make it different, instruction different and unusual, then it puts them in that positive emotion, so that when they even get into the exam room, right, they will be able to remember a lot of the things that they have been taught or they have studied. All right, so this is very important, that how the information, the conditions under which the information is being encoded is so critical for its retrieval. And students really have to be mindful that if they are learning for exams, then how they learn, they have to create the same condition that they might have under the exams hall or the exams room, so that the states or the conditions for remembering or retrieving the information in the exams room should not be different from the conditions under which they were actually practicing for that particular exam. So it's likewise, teachers can help with that process in terms of making sure that how the information was first encoded really is done in that positive atmosphere where students were thinking, constructing meaning. And for that matter, when retrieval is required of them through an assessment, they will be able to remember easily. Another strategy that we can use here is chunking, right? And here, I mean, you might have been taught about 40 topics in a particular subject. Under each of these 40 topics or big ideas, there are a number of contents that you are supposed to be learning. So what students can do is to help actually to use chunking, right? Group all the information under the big idea or the specific concept, right? So that when you do that, it helps you to remember pieces of information about that big concept. So an example is here. If you are studying about demand, for example, some of the information that you need to be able to remember is the meaning of demand, right? And how demand is represented. as a graph, as a table, and the nature of that demand curve. So that is one set of information that you should be able to remember about it. And then the various types of demand, all right? Individual demand, the market demand, and even how they are calculated or obtained, especially the market demand, as well as the factors that influences demand. All right, so if students are able to group the information like that, okay, under the specific content, then they will be able to take those information bit by bit, and they will be able to remember a lot about that specific big idea or the concept that they have studied. So that's a typical example. All the key information about demand, you can put them in a concept map like this, and that really will help you to chunk it, right? And you can do same for supply, you can do same for the market and how prices are doing.
You are taking each of your topics and reorganizing them into big areas where you can help make sense out of.
Exactly. So once you group them in the top into the big ideas, like I use economics because that's more of my subject area. So you have demand, you have supply, market, all those big concepts. Each of these concepts have a body of information under them. So that is how you group that body of information, like in this example. So if you pick demand, for example, you need to know what it is, right? You need to know how it is represented in terms of the demand schedules, the demand curve, and establishing the relationship between price and quantity. You should be able to tell us what influences the demand for a commodity in terms of increasing or decreasing it, and then the various types of demand, individual and supply, market demand, and even how the market demand is derived. All right. So once you group all the information on the demand this way, retrieving that information about demand is easier.
Yeah.
All right. So that is chunking, grouping the information on a specific concept, and that enables you to remember all the pieces of information associated with that big concept.
For the learner, I can easily foresee you will need to have an idea of how your past questions or questions on the concept are structured to give you an idea, or study other materials like examiner's report, or even consult your teacher for some guidance as to what are the main areas under this topic so that I can organize my information under them. Because sometimes I think some students struggle with organization. And so left to them alone, they may not be able to do this.
So if you look at some examination bodies like the Cambridge International, some of the courses they are still, they have what they call the learner guides. And that learner guides will help the students to really know what they need to know for each of the assessments. So all the concepts in a particular concept, in a particular subject area, they have grouped them and they've shown what the learning objectives are, all the key information that you should be able to remember or know and understand or be able to do in reference to that big idea. So it helps students to be able to group them. But like you said, if students don't have access to such a curriculum resource, then they can rely on all the available documents to know that in my maths lessons, maybe I have 40 topics or 20 topics. Under each of the topics, these are the pieces of information under each of them. If they're able to organize that information that way, then it's really helps them to remember. One of the things that I told in a maths teacher, for instance, is that if you have 10 topics, under each of the topics, maths deals with a lot of processes, formulas, and conventions, right?
Yeah.
So it's important that students know, for example, that under topic 1, maybe there are five formulas that you should be able to use to manipulate or solve problems under that particular concept. The students should have an idea what that formula is and how to use that formula, when to use it, and how to use it. Right. So if they have that piece of information all together, then when they sit whatever assessment you put them, it will be easy for the students. If you remember that topic, then he will remember the piece of information that is the formulas that they need to use, when, for what, and then how to use it. If they have that information, they can easily remember and be able to apply those concepts in solving the problems that might be posed to them in an assessment process.
Okay.
So we've talked about retrieval, but there are several retrieval practices, like elaboration, for instance. When you study something, you encode an information, it is best to actually write it in your own words, right? Bring out the information, not just note making. I'm not just talking about note making, reading and making notes. I'm talking about reading an information and then saying it from your memory without looking at the paper or the notes or the textbook. That is a retrieval process, getting that information out, right? There are several of this. So what I've just done, talked about, is that look at what the information is, cover it, and then copy it from your head.
Okay.
That is also a retrieval process. And I think one of the retrieval practices that teachers do is asking questions in class. So when I ask the students a question, they are not supposed to open a book and look at it. They are supposed to tell you the answer from memory,
Yes.
what they know about it. So that is also a retrieval process. So if students use these processes, that enables them to call out information out of memory. It's a very hard thing, but it is the best way to really retain and recall and remember the information that you have encoded. And it is also the best way to actually learn and to develop deep understanding of the things that are being taught, right? Another last practice here is a deliberate practice. We talked about spacing. So if you go to a lesson, let's say I still use a math example, it's about adding fractions, okay, or multiplying. You need to spend a number of days practicing on your own as a student, right? Studying how to add fractions, solving a lot of questions on that. That is deliberate practice. Practicing that skill continually and intentionally until it's crystallized in your mind that you can actually add fractions, right? So the same happens with the college students. If you just go to a lecture room, the lecturer has given all the information. What is key is that you need to spend time learning, studying, what you call it, that information that you just received from that lesson, and then practice it till you, over a long period of time, till you know that you've really understood or have had a deep grasp understanding of the literature that has just been be shared with you through the lecture. So deliberately going over something over and over again. And that is what some of the top footballers do.
Yes.
We know about Beckham, right? How he's able to kill the ball wherever to the right spot. If you read about his practice time and how often he does that in terms of kicking the ball from different spots of the field to a particular destination, then you will not be surprised when you see him on the field and he passes the ball from a far distance accurately to another person. You should know that that has come out of deliberate practice. He has performed that thing over and over again over a period. And that is what has built the mastery over the concept. And students have to do that. All the things that they have been taught, they need to practice it continually.
If I get this example you are just sharing here, it means that for me, the student, I need to look at all the sub areas under this particular unit. And then for each particular practice, focus on one of them.
Yes.
And then when I do practice one on finding how to simplify fractions,
Yes.
I need to do another practice too on how to simplify fractions,
Yes.
where there's a different set of questions at
Yes.
my disposal. then
Exactly.
practice 3, practice 4.
You have to
When I
build
move
up.
on to, when I move on to now probably adding fractions, then it's a different aspect under fractions.
Yeah.
There too, I need to do about 4 different practices on it.
More
And I'm deliberate on that.
yeah.
And if I'm consistent doing this, then I'm perfecting my understanding of that. And
Perfect.
that is a strategy that a learner should have so
Yeah.
that they use it to prepare to help them recall.
Exactly.
Because if you don't have these things, recall could be very, very difficult for you. By this, you have the different forms in which the questions will come, and then you have an exposure to all the different ways. And so that whatever way it comes, you are able to attack the question the right way.
Excellent. So that's basically that. So just learning an information once, it doesn't mean that you are going to be able to retrieve it. You know that a lot of those information will be lost
Yeah.
by the 20 days or in a few seconds when you come back to it. It is when you do continual practice with intention of really mastering that before you move on. Over time, spacing is very important. Over time, it helps you to really have a deep grasp of it. Yeah.
Okay, so in a nutshell, what would we say is our summary of the key techniques we need to use to help students to recall?
Right. So we've been saying that encoding, even though it's the most preferred teaching and learning practice, it is the least productive as far as learning is concerned, right? Because a lot of the information that we take in or encode, actually we forget them easily. And it has nothing to do with your ability or your skill set or what you know or don't know or understand. Just over time, it goes up. it just leaves your mind, all right? So it tells you that remembering is an effortful task. It doesn't come easily, but you can easily forget, but you can't easily remember. So you can remember through retrieval, right? Try learning using strategies that enables you to bring out information out of memory, right? Instead of just rereading information, use approaches that has to do with bringing out information. And what teachers can do to help students get information out of their head is by testing them frequently, is by making sure that whatever they teach them never leaves the test paper. They are always there. So that all the skill sets that they learned yesterday will still be on the text. And the students will know that they need to keep remembering all those sets of information over a period of time. And for the student, whatever you are taught, keep practicing it, deliberate practice over a period of time. And make sure that you are grouping all the information under a big idea. So if you have been taught about fractions, everything under fraction, you should be able to group them through a concept map. And that will help you when you hear fraction, you can be able to remember all the pieces of information that is associated with that. If we're able to do this, this will aid sound recall in the classroom, and that we will see a number of students improving in their learning as well as their performance in the subjects that we teach.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation on techniques for effective recall. I know over the past 2 episodes that we've done on enabling learning, we've really equipped our audience with a lot of rich strategies they can use to help the learners learn and learn properly. We want to encourage people to follow us on all social media handles, edutransform.dh. Look forward to our next episode on enabling learning, which is creating multiple pathways for meaningful learning. Creating multiple pathways for meaningful learning. We'll come back to you on LITE Saturdays with Kwadwo and Kwesi, and we want you to look out for us on all social media handles, like, share, and make comments on all our materials that you find on social media, and then invite others to also join us so that together we can transform learning across schools in Africa. Thank you very much for joining us on this particular episode, and want to see you again next time. Have a good time. Bye-bye.